Hello, I'm Stephen Toop, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, and I welcome you to this Alumni Festival session, the United Nations Global Compact for Migration, Aspirations and Realities. Throughout history, migration has been part of the human experience, whether triggered by trade, desire, climate change, war, studies, or work. I myself traveled to Cambridge first as a PhD student to benefit from a first-class education, and then almost 30 years later to become the 346th Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, the first non-Briton to do so. The benefits of mobility in higher education are widely recognized. Going abroad to study or to train develops professional, social, and intercultural skills, as well as enhancing employability. According to pre-COVID statistics, there were 4.8 million international students globally, of whom approximately 1/10 were in the UK. For a top research university such as Cambridge, global mobility is key to attracting the brightest students, scholars, and staff from an international talent pool. Mobility is also vital for facilitating initiatives and collaborations across the world. Now more than ever, our work takes place on a global scale. We build computers in Cambridge, grow tomatoes in Mexico, empower education in India, and help protect cultures, languages, and species across the planet. Global movement offers opportunities for cross-cultural artistic encounters and economic, intellectual, and material exchanges. These exchanges are a source of prosperity, innovation, and sustainable development in our globalized world. And yet, just as human movement, mobility, and migration represent one of the greatest achievements of the 21st century, they also represent some of the greatest societal challenges. Today, human movement is at record levels. A recent World Bank report suggests that climate change could force over 140 million people to migrate within countries by 2050. Millions of others may cross international boundaries. With this comes challenges to global and national social orders, with large influxes of migrants overwhelming humanitarian responses, reconfiguring economies, potentially contributing to conflict and political instability, or being exploited politically to justify repressive measures. The creation of the Center for the Study of Global Human Movement at Cambridge is a transdisciplinary response to this complex human phenomenon, exploring the interconnections between movement, mobility, and migration on the one hand, and knowledge exchanges and global cooperation on the other. I'm delighted that Dr. Tugba Basaran, Director of the Center for the Study of Global Human Movement, will be joined today by Cambridge alumnus Jonathan Prentice. Jonathan graduated from Emmanuel College with a law degree. He's now head of Secretariat of the United Nations Network on Migration, with responsibility for the implementation of this historic UN Global Compact, which is committed to improving cooperation on international migration. During this fireside chat, they will explore agreement and controversy, implementation, and review of the Compact.
A wonderful welcome by our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Stephen Toop. On behalf of the Center for the Study of Global Human Movement, it is my great honor to welcome our distinguished guest, Mr. Jonathan Prentice. I am truly delighted that Jonathan has agreed to join us today and share with us his personal insights into the adoption and implementation of the UN Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration. Jonathan first served as Chief of Office for the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for International Migration, responsible for supporting the intergovernmental negotiations which led to the adoption of the Global Compact for Migration in December 2018. Since then, Jonathan has been responsible for setting up and heading the newly established United Nations Network on Migration, which is a cornerstone for the implementation of the Compact. Jonathan has an outstanding career and his resume reads as if straight from the news headlines, so I would like to just say a few points from that. Jonathan has worked for the United Nations since 1994, starting with the Department of Political Affairs in New York, followed by a posting in Cambodia in the years immediately after the UN Transitional Authority, a posting in Timor-Leste during the UN administration, culminating in independence in May 2002. He was then the Chief of Staff for Vieira de Mello on his appointment as High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2003, and part of the team that was sent to Baghdad in mid-2003. Subsequently, he became an advisor to the succeeding High Commissioner Luis Arbor and served as Human Rights Advisor in Indonesia. Jonathan left the UN in 2010 to become Director of Policy for the International Crisis Group, but rejoined the United Nations in 2017. And this was about the same time as Antonio Guterres, the 9th Secretary General of the United Nations, took office, shortly after the adoption of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, in which UN member states agreed to work towards the adoption of two compacts: a global compact on refugees and a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. March 2017, the UN Secretary General appointed Luis Arbor as the Special Representative for International Migration, and around the very same time, Jonathan was appointed as the Chief of Office, responsible for supporting the intergovernmental negotiations for the Global Compact for Migration. So Jonathan, welcome again. Let me immediately start out by asking you, how did it feel arriving on the first day at the office and having no smaller tasks than the responsibility for a compact with a rather tight deadline, less than 2 years, bringing together more than 190 states and hundreds, if not thousands, of stakeholders?
Good evening, Tugba, and many thanks for arranging this discussion. It's a real pleasure to be not with you, but virtually with you all this evening. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the Alumni Festival and also thank Stephen Toop for his very, I think, insightful opening comments, which really, in 4 minutes, he managed to pack in, I think, the parameters of the fascinating migration debate. I wish I could give you a glamorous answer to your opening question, but the reality of setting up these offices in the UN is somewhat mundane. This was a boutique office. It was a temporary mandate, as you said, for 2 years, with a very specific focus, supporting the states in delivering on the creation of the Global Compact. So what I think occupied me from day one, other than it being a real pleasure being back in the building and seeing old friends, was pretty prosaic things like making sure we had office space, figuring out who would staff the office itself. We were reliant on secondments from throughout the system because, of course, the migration field involves many different parts of the UN system, whether it is UNICEF and their obvious concerns over the well-being of migrant children, or UN Women, or the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or the High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, the International Labour Organization. It's an alphabet soup of agencies that have equities on the migration agenda, and we called on many of them to help staff the office. And then I think there were, perhaps slightly more profound thoughts, because of course, in 2017, Europe was still, I think, reeling. We can discuss whether it was fair or unfair to be reeling from what it viewed as a migration crisis. Migration had become a vexed topic on the agendas of many Western and other states. And so I think thoughts were really thinking about how we could help navigate the process through.
Right, but within a very short time, there were a number of curveballs thrown at you. And I'm thinking here, December 2017, especially. What we heard in the news, that's the only part which I can say, is just before the beginning of the intergovernmental negotiations, the US ambassador to the UN at that time, Nikki Haley, informed the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, literally hours before the preparatory meeting in Puerto Vallarta in Mexico, that the US was withdrawing from the pact. Is that correct? Did we hear it correctly? And do you still remember your first thoughts? And how was this received? How did you and the wider office deal with this curveball? Or wasn't it a curveball? Were you expecting it actually?
Yeah, we were expecting it. I think the previous US administration had set out its stall on the migration agenda and on multilateralism with minimal ambiguity. So their withdrawal from this process was not a surprise. But it raises interesting issues because the essence of multilateralism is providing a space for everyone. The power of multilateralism is that however much there are compromises, it brings the whole community of states together. So there is always, I think, a tension between whether it is better to have states who are reluctant on a certain issue to be in a process, or whether actually it is better for them to be out of that process so that others who are committed to it can move forward. And of course, the absurdity with that position of the US was this was a member state-led process. The drafting of the Global Compact was for the member states themselves, and it's non-binding. This is not a legal document, and again, there's a lot we could discuss around that. To some extent, the age of treaties. We may not be in an age of treaties at the moment. That increasingly cooperative frameworks that the UN are creating, such as the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, are exercises in goodwill and consensus and cooperation rather than subject to legal stricture. And that just may be the way the world is moving after a 20th century that was really very ripe with legally binding treaty construction. And then, of course, you've got on the other side, there were some states that remained engaged in the process, but were clearly had animosity towards it, including a number of states in Europe. And so was it better to have them in? And that, I think, maybe diluted the ability of other more flexible states to adopt a more progressive stance. So yes, of course, it is regrettable when states pull out of a multilateral process, but I don't think in this instance it was entirely unforeseen.
Since you were just talking about the non-binding character of this agreement, non-legally binding character of this agreement, could you maybe explore a little bit for our audience, what does really a compact mean? I still remember when it first came out, the Global Compact for Migration, a lot of people were even writing about it. What does it really mean, a compact? And especially from a legal perspective. You have already...
Sorry, I interrupted, but it's a very good question. I mean, you look up the definition of compact and it is not particularly clear, except when it refers to that makeup thing, which is a precise definition, but not the one I think they had in mind. And of course, when you translate compact into French, it has a much more binding connotation in that language and as I understand it in a number of other languages of the UN. But we do have compacts. We had the Global Compact for Business, I think is quite a long-standing one. I think it is the word that is used to describe essentially a cooperative framework. That this is not binding. Interestingly, though, I say it's not binding, it is heavily grounded in international law. If you look at the opening paragraphs of the Global Compact, there are long lists of treaty obligations that states have signed up to in any event. And one of the guiding principles of the compact is that it, state actions with regard to migration governance must be compliant with the rule of law, must be compliant with their international human rights obligations. But it was not normative in the sense of itself trying to become a yardstick by which to measure states' progress in legally binding terms. That would never have taken off. We wouldn't have any form of framework if the starting point was an insistence on it being legally binding.
Right. And that leads me maybe to another question. So let's go forward to February 2018. The zero draft comes out and the intergovernmental negotiations start. So, and I understand there were 6 rounds of negotiations. At least these are the official draft versions which circulated to which everybody had access. And I was just wondering if you could say a few words about how member states influence such processes such as this, and what were the key contestations or contentious issues that you encountered? Whatever you can share with us, we'll appreciate it.
No, absolutely. I mean, you're right in your summary of the process. There were 6 rounds of consultations. After each round, the co-facilitators, the ambassadors to the UN of Mexico and Switzerland, took the comments back into conclave and edited and tweaked the text and then resubmitted it. Now, this really was a process that was driven and drafted by member states. Again, the migration goes, as they see it, goes very much to the heart of their notions of sovereignty. Who can and cannot cross their borders is a matter that, largely for domestic political reasons, is of primary importance. So they wanted to have complete control over it. I'm going to take my glasses off because it makes me look like I've got screen glare. But there were a number of points of tension and contestation that played out. One was, as I said earlier, a very clear desire for this document, this framework, not to be legally binding and not to generate new legal obligations, so that it wasn't going to be normative in the language of the UN. And then you had a number of other tensions, and I'm giving this a very broad brush summary. You had tensions between countries that see themselves as countries of destination, that typically receive migrants more than send migrants out, and countries of origin, the inverse. And they, of course, had, and again, this is a basic summary, different interests. Some were more interested in focusing on the ability to return migrants to their country of origin. Others were more interested in expanding legal pathways. Of course, it's not the Global Compact for migration, it's the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. So the idea being that one way to diminish irregular migration would be to enhance one's ability to travel in a regular fashion. So can we expand legal pathways to diminish those pressures to travel by irregular means? And then there were tensions and discussions around the status in country of irregular migrants, those migrants who have not traveled in an authorized fashion. And of course, that has come to the fore in an extremely graphic way with the advent of the pandemic. Should irregular migrants, individuals who have absolutely no status, be entitled to a COVID vaccine? my view is self-evidently they should, because it's a public health benefit. But if in so queuing up for a vaccine, you risk being deported, how do you balance those factors? And then I think there were tensions around the push and pull factors. What were more compelling reasons why people move? Do people move because they think their intended destination is drawing them there for whatever reason, a better life in some way, shape or form? Or are they leaving because they feel compelled to leave because their circumstances at home are such that they see no other choice? So whether it's we focus on how we understand the drivers of conflict, are they primarily push factors or pull factors? And depending on your vantage point, you would have a different take on that. So I think those in some ways very crudely were some of the points of contestation or debate, maybe.
Right. I thought you just brought in a really interesting point, which is about the pandemic and how it may have changed certain issues around the compact, or highlighted certain issues around the compact. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more, maybe in that direction? Did the pandemic have an important effect on the way the compact is being perceived today, or?
Well,
did it bring new points of contestation?
I don't think we're at the stage yet where, hopefully, I mean, we're now 3 years into the life of the compact, 3 or 4 years. We're not yet at the stage where it trips off the tongue of policy makers, but migration, I think it has had a profound impact on how migration is discussed and impacted, both in good and bad ways. I think there is a much greater recognition now of the vital importance of frontline workers in health services, in the care services, in the food production, in the logistics, so on and so forth, and that the percentage of these frontline services that are staffed by migrants is, in many societies, hugely significant. We wouldn't have had those frontline services. They would have collapsed without the migrant labour force. And that's undoubtedly, I think, been a positive thing, both for frontline workers generally, and understanding that they perform really imperative tasks in our society and are often underpaid, and for migrants who form a significant part of them. But I think this is outweighed largely by the global halt in travel, which has had a huge impact. And I think the implications of this we will not fully understand for some time ahead. The mass returns of, tens and tens of thousands of labour forces have been returned to their countries of origin. Those countries are expected to absorb them, have the capacity to absorb and reintegrate them in a sustainable fashion, irrespective of their own situations. Many others have been stranded. Remittances, the money that migrants send home to their communities and families, which outstrips global aid by multiples, has been hit. Not hit as much as we had feared, but it has been significantly hit. And how we're going to restart this global mobility in a manner that is equitable is not clear, I think, at the moment. And, certain recent reports that some countries' vaccines are going to be better acknowledged than other countries' vaccines does suggest that if we're not careful about this, if we don't have open conversations, we're going to end up in a two-tiered or a multi-tiered system of mobility moving forward, which, far from creating predictability and equity in the migration field, is going to, I think, further complicate things. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, you do have the issue of how do you ensure that your public health imperatives are realized if at the same time you have a policy that is hostile to irregular migrants. That can be a challenge. So I think those are some of the issues on the migration agenda that COVID has thrown up in stark relief.
Thank you. Let me just go back to 2018. And I have a quote here from the United States mission to the United Nations in 2018, which says, and I think it's to some extent representative of the concerns which were out there in 2018. They say, we believe the compact and the process that led to its adoption, including the New York Declaration, represent an effort by the United Nations to advance global governance at the expense of the sovereign right of states to manage their immigration systems in accordance with their national laws, policies, and interests. I am thinking that a lot of our audience might be interested in understanding what would you reply to those who claim that the Global Compact infringes sovereignty?
Read it. It's not an exciting read. So, and in fact, when there was so much controversy around the Global Compact that governments in Europe were literally falling, I mean, the government of Belgium collapsed over this. My children who live in Brussels were very proud, and they were going around their schools saying their father was responsible for bringing the government down, which I think was possibly inflating my role in it. But a popular presenter in Estonia read the entire Global Compact out on radio. It took him 2.5 hours. And his point was, really, read the thing. If you're going to be so vehemently against it, at least read it. And secondly, it's pretty mundane. This is a collection of practices that in many cases are largely being undertaken by many states in many different locations. It is not some radical open borders agenda setting. But that's not really the point, because I think we do have a breakdown in discourse, not necessarily about migration, though migration is caught up in it. But that breakdown in discourse that plays itself out in a number of ways, that plays itself out in the Brexit debate, that plays itself out in the election of the Trump administration, that plays itself out in the rise of populist governments, that plays itself out in the disaffection of large segments of our communities. And the dialogue has not connected. We mock, when I say we, I don't say those who style themselves as liberals, mock the Trump supporters for being from a certain demographic and a certain type of person. And we don't actually always have the ability or the time or the patience or the wit to sit down and really try and understand what it is that may be driving some of their concerns, which to some extent manifest themselves in an anti-migration discourse. Another point I would say is I think that leaders have a huge responsibility. The crisis in Europe was, in numerical terms, a significant development. In relative terms, given the size of the European population, perhaps not so significant. But it came on it came on the back of years of at best ambivalent discourse about migrants, often hostile. So it's very difficult to help change and guide an electorate and a populace if you're suddenly seen to be radically changing your tune. And the third point I think I would make is that this is all interlinked. You know, we have foreign policies in many quarters that don't assist the ability of people to stay in their own country. It is not the case that everyone wakes up in Africa and decides they want to leave to Europe. There's a range, a host, a multitude of reasons for that. But the notion that is sometimes projected out there in popular discourse that we are holding at bay mass movements is simply not borne out by any of the data. But there can be some trigger points. How we are engaging on the climate. We haven't discussed the climate yet, but we should do. How we are engaging on the climate, Stephen mentioned it in his opening comments is one. How we conduct our peace and security agenda is another. The collapse of the Gaddafi regime, whatever one may think about Gaddafi, removed a major regulatory valve on the flow of people. The mass movement of Syrians into Europe took place not immediately on their departure from Syria, but several years after, when aid to the World Food Programme was cut. And so they were residing in neighboring countries, and suddenly their food was cut. They realized several years in, their prospects were not getting any better. And so what do we expect? So there are a number of interlinkages that I think need to be better understood as well, rather than simply discussing migration in isolation. And I think my final point is, and sorry for slightly rambling, Tugba, is I think we have to find a way to get over the discourse of migrants that treats them solely as angels or as devils. That they're amazing because they're frontline workers. They're amazing because they win a US Open. Or they are these awful people who are crossing in dinghies, or being criminals, or whatever the hell it is up to. The success of the migration agenda will be when we can treat migrants simply as human beings, and that their primary defining character is not necessarily their migrant status.
That's a really extremely important point, I think, and maybe one which is not underlined often enough, because we focus so much on the status, on the legal status of people, rather than on the whole of the human being. Let me just go to the other side there. Let's take the argument of the opposite side, which says, and this is more of a minority, maybe more coming from the legal field especially, which says the Global Compact is affirming state practices, and some state practices which we shouldn't be content with. How would you reply to that?
I mean, this is where I become slightly bureaucratic, I'm afraid, is it's a process that we got a global compact in 2018. It's not that long ago, but let's look back on it. 2018, Europe was pulling itself apart over the migration debate. The UK was in the throes of its Brexit fever. I don't know how to describe it. There was administration in Washington, DC that was inimical to the multilateral agenda. And 154 states said, yeah, this is worth it. Now, personally, I think it would be lovely if they complied with every single objective and every single action point under that objective. But, you know, I point out to colleagues who criticize the compact for not being legally binding, I point out to them, well, the international human rights framework is legally binding. And it's not always clear to me that that's being fully implemented. So we need to, without aiming for the best and without dulling our critical faculties, I think it is important to understand that we're 3 years into a process. The other important point about the Global Compact that I want to stress, I know we only have 14 minutes left, is that the member states were sufficiently brave to build into it mechanisms for follow-up and review, that they agreed that every 2 years at the regional level, and then every 2 years globally, they would come together with partners in NGOs, in academia and other non-governmental sectors to review progress, to identify logjams, to highlight priorities for further action. That commits them, and we shouldn't underplay the significance of that. States take the UN processes quite seriously. They will want to come to the General Assembly next year when the first global review is and say something. They will want to be able to deliver a report card. So yes, it is far from perfect, but we wouldn't have had the need for a global compact if the situation was perfect. You only get these treaties or frameworks or summits in situations where a clear need is identified. If everything was hunky-dory, I wouldn't be here right now.
So let's be a little bit more pragmatic and take it step by step and let the process sharpen the compact over a period of time. Is that
exactly
correct? Yeah,
exactly. And none of that precludes, and again, we shouldn't funnel all migration discourse into the Global Compact. As I said at the outset, there are the international labor treaties, there is the international human rights framework, there is a vast network, an international architecture out there in which human beings can seek protection, amongst them migrants. So it is an important piece in the puzzle, I think a vital piece in the puzzle, but it's not the only piece.
You mentioned the regional reviews and the global review. I think maybe it might be nice for our audience to understand what happened in the regional reviews, what were maybe the issues that were highlighted, and how did the regional reviews function for those who have not been able to follow it?
Yeah, well, I don't blame you if you haven't been able to follow it. The UN processes from the outside are not studies in transparency. But essentially, there were 5 regional reviews in the Americas and the Caribbean, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia and the Pacific, and I'm forgetting one. And the member states came together and discussed implementation challenges, discussed what they were doing, submitted national reports. These are voluntary national reports on how they are complying with the Global Compact or implementing the Global Compact, and also stakeholders. Stakeholders is the UN term for non-governmental partners. And again, I think one of the achievements of the Global Compact was its explicit recognition and baking into the compact itself, this recognition that dealing with migration was beyond the capacity of governments alone. Local authorities, for example, are sometimes amongst the most progressive and dynamic in addressing migration challenges, because of course they bear the brunt of the pros and the cons of migration in almost all instances. But I think what was revealing about the regional reviews, a couple of things. One is states engaged. stakeholders engaged. This was not seen to be simply a tick box exercise. But what I am focusing on at the moment is that, intriguingly, the Global Compact is made up of 23 objectives across a range of issues that are on the migration agenda: remittances, proof of legal identity, return and reintegration, legal pathways, saving lives. You know, it is all there. But across the regional reviews, there was a remarkable consistency in which objectives received the most attention and which objectives received relatively little or no attention. And so issues like alternatives to immigration detention, this notion that you can be put in prison simply because of your migration status, received relatively little attention, even though a lot of work is being done on it. To my mind, most glaringly, the objectives around saving lives and developing coordinated approaches to missing migrants received relatively little attention. So I think in the coming months leading up to the global review that I mentioned will be in New York next year, I would like to figure out how we can highlight some of these forgotten objectives and make sure that they receive the attention that they evidently merit.
Since you brought up the global review, again, I think a lot of people are asking themselves, well, what is the global review? What's going to happen? What can we expect from it? Are there any extra additions you would like to make to that apart from what you have already said?
Well, it's the first one, and that's important. Now, again, this is a UN process. The UN processes have a certain logic to them. The principal logic being is that every state is treated absolutely equally. But that logic then requires a rather heavy choreography. There is a lot of process in these meetings. Having said that, because it's the first, I think collectively we have an opportunity to shape its tone and its level of ambition. So I'm working with a large number of stakeholders, encouraging them to send in ideas to harass and cajole their governments to focus on what they consider to be the priorities. So what I hope comes out of the IMRF is the further bedding down. IMRF is the global review, sorry. In the UN, you speak in initials. It's a terrible, terrible thing. The global review is that it will further bed down the global compact, that it will really become a fixture in our international landscape, that there will be more resources, funding put into programming under the global compact, and that there will be some sense of priorities moving forward. Clearly, everything is important, but at some point we do need also to identify what right now we think might be the key priorities. And I think some, I think some potential priorities could be how we recover equitably from the pandemic. We discussed that a little earlier. The impact of climate, the intersection between climate and mobility, and also the issues around narrative and how we combat discrimination. Those to me are potential priorities, but of course I will be drafting the outcome declaration.
Well, we have so far mostly discussed the role of the states, but you mentioned already that a compact implies many more stakeholders. And with that, I would like to go towards the question of where do you see the role of various stakeholders? You mentioned that you're trying to get them to be more engaged in the process, the way I understood it. And particularly when we're talking of the various stakeholders, where do you see the role of academia, universities, such as Cambridge, and how they can support the process? And are there any activities or any stakeholders which are outstanding, which we should take as example?
Yeah, no, they're really a key piece of the puzzle, and by stakeholders, I'm referring to civil society, non-governmental organizations, to national human rights institutions, trades unions, obviously, given the huge intersection between migration and labor, but also the private sector, diaspora organizations, migrants themselves. It's always nice to include the subjects of what we're working on. But also academia, and I think the academic world can play an important role in a number of ways. The search for data is a constant challenge. Getting good, accurate data to help us understand fully the subject that we're dealing with across the range. Across the range of the migration issues that are covered in the Global Compact. Whenever you speak to any government, they say they need more data. They need a better understanding of what actually is going on. And I think that academia can play an important role. And then there's also the power of soft advocacy. I mean, the fact that Cambridge has set up this institution, I presume, means they consider migration to be an important topic. And that they wish to contribute. And I presume it is not an anti-migration agenda. I presume it is, so correct me if I'm wrong, but, and so I think there is that soft advocacy element of helping people to understand what this is, what this isn't, why it's actually not particularly scary, why it is in any event here to stay, because it's a facet of the human condition, and that process of very sort of slow sensitization plays, I think, a really vital role. I think the convening power of academe is priceless. The ability to bring people together in fora that are not threatening, where you can have an exchange of views, where you can go home at the end of the day and not, want to kill the other person. I think that is of huge value, and an ability also to be outside of the pressure of, you have your own pressure, so I'm not saying it's pressure free, but outside the pressure of the intergovernmental world, and say, okay, we can actually make some priorities here. Often in the intergovernmental world, as I was saying, they have to cover everything because there's such a range of equities out there. But I think you're in a position to say, actually, we want to drill down on issue X or issue Y. I think that's a great liberation at times. So those, I would say, are some of the advantages.
Thank you. That is really useful. Configuring also our own roles here. We are running though out of time. I see we have still 30 seconds. So I want to say, first of all, this was really fascinating for me. I really appreciate that you took the time to join us and gave us a lot of food for thought. And I do hope we can continue these conversations in the future. And as I said, I learned a lot, and I've been following the process somehow throughout the last years, and I'm sure our audience did learn even more. Thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan, and it was a real pleasure having you at this session.
Right, well, Tugba, thank you very much. I hope it was interesting. I enjoyed it. I do see that people in the virtual audience have asked a number of questions and we haven't had time to get to them. I am happy if there is a way for these questions to be sent to me. I'm happy to give my views outside of this session. I really appreciate that people took the time to engage, and I'm only sorry that Tugba and I weren't able to sort of engage directly back. So if there is an opportunity for me to do so after this event, to the organisers, please, I'm at your disposal. But thank you for inviting me.
Thank you once more. And for all the questions which were addressed, you can also send them to our email address info@humanmovement.cam.ac.uk, and we'll be happy to forward them on to Jonathan. Thank you and have a nice evening.